position is a Chief Academic Officer and Dean of Academics, or one would say Provost, for the New Mexico Military Institute. It's a position which I've held for the past almost 15 years. Prior to that time, in 2007, I retired from, after nearly 42 years active duty in the U.S. Air Force in a variety of different assignments and operations in intelligence and policy and strategic planning. A big part of that was as a permanent professor and head of political science at the Air Force Academy for 25 years. That is a position that is required for maintaining the stability and accreditation of the Academy. My position is in a presidential appointed position, advising consent of the Senate to ensure the development of young men and women who go into the Air Force.
That's amazing. So you've been a very busy man your entire life. You have many accomplishments, and today we're going to ask you a few questions about those. The very first question I have for you, sir, is what motivated you to execute the ambitions you clearly achieved in life?
I think when you look at that, the overriding theme has been service to others. I'm always reminded of remarks that President Ford gave at the funeral for former Secretary Simon, and he said that you make a living on what you get, but you make a life on what you give. And it has been that theme which has, I think, been involved in much of my life. Service before self, helping others, and in whatever the sector of society one does that. Originally, my ambitions, and you talk about ambitions, was to become a member of the United States Foreign Service. And that reason I attended Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. That just, however, naturally evolved into a position in the Air Force, which again was able for me to achieve those same ambitions. And that reality of, as President Ford so well put it, to serve others, to make a life, not just a living. Not specifically. Again, when one thinks about one's future, one has a vision or what you hope that to be. Of course, time changes that. If you had told me when I was graduating from Georgetown that I would have spent almost 40 years in the Air Force, I would have said, what are you smoking? The question is, how did that come about? I guess, though, no one has a crystal ball in that regard, but I guess I must look to the family in which I grew up in. Two brothers were not military in their careers. My older brother was in the Navy. He was enlisted Navy during the World War II, served in the Pacific Theater. My younger brother was in the Navy, enlisted during the Korean conflict. Both of them served their country, and then afterwards came back and raised a family. I might also point out and talk about this thing about the family, and I think it's so important today because I think it's not there anymore to a large extent. And that is a sense of patriotism and commitment to the nation and to the values that make up this nation. And so, for example, I was born in, I'm now giving you an idea of how old I am. I was born in 1943, and my family named me after the two major general officers in World War II. Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of Specific Forces, and Dwight David Eisenhower, Commander-in-Chief Chief of European Forces. Now, did that indicate at that time in this journey that you talk about that become a general officer? No, I don't think they had that in mind, and I didn't have that in mind. Here I am 2 days old, well, I'm going to be a general officer. No, but my point is, families in that conflict understood the nation, and it wasn't, no big deal. We'll name him that. So to that extent, when you ask about thinking about what I would become, not specifically, but and looking behind me and looking back, I would think that tends to be a reason for where we are today. My message to the community is simply to be a community. I'm very much distressed, as others are, that there's a tremendous polarization that's taking place in American society today. You can always, and it's a main stream of part of the nation, of the way in which we live, to challenge and to have an opinion and the freedom to express the opinion. But that oftentimes now has become polarized, and so it's not only do I differ with you in opinion, there's somehow wrong with you because you have that opinion. And so when we talk about a community is a group of people who have different views. The strength of our country is that diversity, but having those different views, they are able to work together. So if having this estate sale and so forth in what was being available to the community portrays that message, that's what I see in why it's allowing the community to obtain a piece of that legacy. And then, of course, the other important piece of that, and I don't mean to sound self-serving because it's not at all that in mind or intended, it became known to those folks who did come for the sale and for the auction, which, by the way, was fantastically conducted and led with great leadership on the part of the organization that did that, was that the revenue that was obtained from the sale of the items and in the auction was going towards an endowment to increase the opportunity for students to have the same opportunities in life. In other words, leadership development. Study abroad is important because today, and it has been the case, we are in a global society and a global economy. Thomas Friedman, the New York Times author of books and columns, calls it the world. One of his more famous books, one of his earlier books, was "The World is Flat." He wasn't challenging Christopher Columbus, but what he was saying, that communications has resulted in the fact that we are much more interconnected. It used to be that it was nation states that interacted with one another, and it was governments that interacted with one another. And then we went into an era where there were other than governments interacting. But now we have people interacting. An individual, any part of the world, can have as much influence on the events of the world as at one time only a state or a government of a state. So what does that mean? It means that we all are, and it sounds simplistic, we are citizens of the world. And for that reason, we've got to understand the diversity that exists. Globalization oftentimes gets a bad name because folks don't understand the value that comes from it. There are obstacles and difficulties, certainly, but that's where understanding comes, and that's why in the education process it's very important that we make students aware of that. And this is a trend, certainly here at the school, and certain things we have done in the past 5 years or so looking for study abroad. But it's a trend referred to as internationalization at all institutions of higher learning in the country today. I would guess and estimate, again, being brought up in a family that believed in that. It meant being brought up in a society where one saw many role models. I mean, it was a way of life then. And another way to put that is being brought up in a Christian family, in a Christian society, attending Catholic primary school and high school, and even college. Even in the military has that same value system of service. I mean, what greater? I mean, it's almost too simplistic to say, what greater service can you provide to others than to offer your life in defense of them, in whether that is as a first responder, responding to a crime, or responding to a fire, or it entails service as a chaplain, or service as a priest or a doctor. It's all part of that same mantra, if you would.
Okay, perfect. Now, what advice do you have to offer for the future?
You need to have a vision. You need to have a perception of a calling, and in that vision, depending on where you are in your development stages, to have what I like to think of as a grand strategy. How is it that you're going to achieve those goals and objectives that you have? Recognizing that they will change, recognizing that events, some might say fate, but oftentimes you can control your fate based upon the decisions that you make. But recognizing that it's not always going to be the way you want it to be, and you're not going to turn out to be what you thought you would be. One of your earlier questions was about that, and if I ever saw myself in my current position, or what I had become and what my calling had been, no, I would not have. But it is in fact taking advantage of even the failures that you have. Failure is a very important learning experience, and it should be considered not as a negative but a positive factor in one's education. I'm reminded of Dyson, the folks that make the vacuum cleaners. I remember a remark that he made one time. He said, "We celebrate failure in our company." Why? Because you learn from failure. You learn from the hardships. You're never going to learn to be a good sailor if the only time you go to sea is when the sea is calm. You're never going to be a good pilot if the only time you fly is when the weather is good. And understanding that when you do that, you take risk, and there's always the possibility of failure as a result of that. Well, I'm going to plagiarize on that, and plagiarize from the Air Force. The Air Force has 3 overall values, which, by the way, in a very small way, we're involved because these are the core values of the Air Force. But they began in the classroom. They began as the core values of the Air Force Academy, and they are first and foremost integrity. Integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all you do. And so when you ask for 3 pieces of advice for the younger generation, those would be the key. Everything else should correlate and relate to those things.
Do you have a life's mantra?
Well, I suppose depends on how what you define mantra to be, whether it's a saying or it's an image or perspective. I think it may have already come out in when we were talking about service. If there's something that reflects that one should look to when one faces obstacles in life, I would say it's the cross.
You have to cross. You have to go.
That's right.
Now, we know that you're leaving me, and not just because you'd like to, but it's well deserving. It's a time where you get to finally breathe with your grandchildren, live the life that you may have not planned. As you said earlier, we don't plan exactly everything in our lives, but it's important to wake up the next day and plan for the future. What are your plans for your future?
Well, I think you've kind of captured them in what you just said. My calling, my goals, and so forth have been essentially accomplished in my profession, and it's now time. To look to the family. Now, it's not that I'm going to be not active. I expect to remain active. I think you die, if not physically, mentally, if you're not. But the difference is that activity will now be focused almost 100% on the family and the grandchildren. And that's a great challenge for me, and I'm sure for many of the folks who are listening to this, because I think many of us may be, as was often referred to somewhat in jest in my early years at the Academy, compulsive overachievers that put more on the plate than can fit on the plate. And while the family is always important, it oftentimes has to be second to what you're doing, especially if you are serving others. And again, I like to emphasize, it's not just wearing the military uniform. It's wearing mufti as you would in the service in the government. It's first responders. It's a doctor who has oftentimes to leave the family to go out and accomplish and work with the sick. But now that shifts completely. What comes first? Not having the responsibilities of whether being in the military or at school or whatever, it's to that family and it's to those the grandchildren, because we can't hold time constant. It's moving on, and they're moving on, and they're making their plans. And so I hope to do that. I'm not seeking anything else, though, as was pointed out to me, that may be true, Doug, but the fact is that others are going to seek you out.
That's true.
So that's the thing I have to make sure I am aware of. It's not a question of age. It's just a question of where in the time that you have remaining in your life, where the number one focus is going to be. Well, it is, in fact, to be themselves, to determine and to answer their calling. And I mentioned to you as we were setting up for this opportunity today that you've given me, that I had been the graduation speaker for our high school and for our junior college. And one of the individuals that I've particularly become familiar with was a gentleman named Wes Moore. And I had met him. And in his book, he talks about the things that I have talked about in my answers to your earlier questions. And that was success and service. And at the graduation, I quoted him, and I think it helps answer this question. He said, quote, "Success and service are increasingly intertwined. To be clear, service doesn't necessarily mean running for office, suiting up in a military uniform, or volunteering for a charity, although it might. Service simply means we embrace the possibility of living for more than ourselves. I am convinced," he says, "that it's the truth that hunts us down. It's our common calling. And when we answer that call, we'll find that the world's challenges and our own work eventually meet." Think how powerful that is. The world's challenges, what needs to be done, and our work, all of the preparation, the learning, and so forth, come together. In other words, in a way, it's like being at the right place at the right time. And so when I talk about what your children aspire to be, I would hope that they would aspire in those ways that he talked about. Purpose in life, and it goes back to the theme, and not to repeat that, but it is they have to have purpose, and that doesn't mean fame. Too often, fame, it becomes a driving force for a young person or one who's advanced in age. It's rather that one has a sense of accomplishment, and I would hope that they would see in me, but in their mother, in their brothers, in their siblings, and in their friends, that same sense of a purpose, of a calling, just like Wes Moore was saying. It's the truth that hunts us down, and when it finds us, we don't reject it, we don't run away from it, and that happens. You have to make a sacrifice. Well, I'm not going to make that sacrifice now, and accept it for what it is. That's what that's what I would hope that they would remember, but not just remember, would put that into practice. I think that's important.
How do you want your legacy to be carried on, and how do you want the world to remember Douglas Murray?
Okay, I guess again I'm going to go back to something I was telling these young graduates that were about to graduate, and I told them something that I think perhaps surprised them. These are the graduates, both in the high school and the junior college, because as you know, New Mexico Military Institute is unique in that we completely integrate secondary and post-secondary education. And a student here doesn't, this is the high school and this is a junior college. No, students are able to go take courses from both. So the message is the same. The message is at this level of one's learning. And it's all about leadership and leadership development. What I told the class was that you are a special class, and we remember that you graduated in 2020, the year of the great pandemic. And it was also the case in the class of 2021. Actually, the class of 2021 has lived in this longer, because if you recall, I know here, March of 2020, so March, April, May, they all were sent home and so forth for that period of time. Well, 2021 was more than 3 or 4 months. It was more like 15 months. But what I told them was, you are the first graduating class since the classes that graduated from this institution and other institutions in 1945 and 1946, in that time frame. Because you are graduating at a time when not just this nation, but this world is being faced by challenges that have only been experienced and only resulted in impacting the lay of life of everyone since World War II. There's no one who lived during that time frame that was engaged in that conflict. Not just those who went off to war, but just think of the events back here in the country. There was rationing. There was families that were disrupted. And there was a commitment. I went back to earlier your question about, my early days and being born during World War II. I said, that has not happened since World War II. Yes, there's been conflict. Yes, there was 9/11, but not where daily life was impacted like that was. And I said, therefore, the challenge to you is that you have lived through that and are living through that, but the challenge is to ensure that the outcomes, because everybody talks about how the pandemic is drastically going to change things. And I can tell you, I could speak quite a while on that subject. Us old professors, we only talk in 50-minute periods. But and I'm not going to talk in a 50-minute period. But I want to say is, those generations that graduated from, let's say, college, or who came back from the war, over the next 5 years, built with those from other nations a system what's now referred to as the liberal international order. It was in organizations like the UN and NATO and the World Bank and the IMF and so forth, and a process where nations realized that if they were to solve the upcoming new worlds and problems, they would be in a situation where they had to work together. And all of that meant and required leadership, because they would ensure that the outcomes of the pandemic in whatever sector of society it would impact will not change the fundamental values and principles upon which this nation was based. And I'm again reminded, and I reminded them to the graduates, that you become what you focus on. Your focus becomes your work becomes your life. What you do with your life will become your legacy. John Kennedy perhaps said it best, and I frequently use this quote: leadership and learning are indispensable to each other. If you were to capture what has my life been about, it's been about leadership and learning. And Robert Frost, one of my favorite poems of Robert Frost, is about walking in the woods and the road less traveled, and came upon a vision in the road, and he took the road less traveled by, and that made all the difference. My point to these young men and women is, graduating in 2020, and you think back, and you'll say, we come back for reunions and so forth. You say, oh, we were the class of 2020, we all were sent home for a few months and so forth. The ones we started in early part of September. We did stay open. We opened. We were able to do that in large part because of the fact that our cadets were able to work with the administration to do that. But what they will remember is they took the road less traveled, and that made all the difference, and began to build a post-pandemic world, different than what was before, hopefully better than was before, but certainly one which had changed.